A 7-year-old blind girl, a dog trained to die for her, and the boy who once called that dog useless. What happened on that ordinary autumn afternoon in Denver changed 4 lives forever, and it started with a truck, a curb, and 4 seconds. Atlas had already survived 1 accident. His shoulder never fully healed. He walked with a limp every single morning, and yet when the moment came he ran. Not away. Toward the same boy who had mocked him, the same boy who had called him worthless. Atlas didn't hesitate for even half a second. But here's what nobody talks about. What that dog did in those 4 seconds didn't just save a life. It broke something open inside a boy who didn't even know he was broken. And 11 months later, that same boy was sitting in a parking lot, pressing his forehead against a steering wheel, crying for a child he had never met. Why? Stay with me. Because this story doesn't go where you think it goes. Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. On the wide pavement outside a small corner bakery on Elmwood Street, 7-year-old Lily sat on a wooden bench with her white cane resting against her knee and her guide dog, Atlas, lying calm and steady at her feet. She couldn't see the gold light falling across her face, but she tilted her chin upward as if she could read it the way others read a page. She could feel its warmth, and for her, that was enough. Atlas was a large, deep brown Labrador with quiet eyes that never stopped moving even when the rest of him was completely still. He watched the street the way a careful guardian watches a door, steady, patient, never blinking for too long. People passed him in waves. Some smiled, some barely noticed. That was fine. Lily and Atlas had long since stopped needing the world to notice them in order to feel whole. 3 teenage boys came around the corner laughing loudly, their voices cutting through the afternoon noise like something sharp and unwelcome. They slowed when they saw Atlas, then stopped entirely. The tallest one nudged the boy beside him and smirked. Within seconds, the laughter shifted into something crueler. They circled Atlas slowly, making mocking comments about a dog trained to lead someone who couldn't see. "What's the point of a dog like that?" one of them said, loud enough for Lily to hear. "Useless." The word landed in the air like a small stone dropped into still water. Before she could respond, the tallest boy reached out and shoved Atlas sideways. The kick that followed sent Lily's cane spinning off the bench and clattering against the pavement. Lily gasped, reaching out instinctively into the empty air. Atlas rose immediately, without a sound, planting himself squarely between the boys and Lily. His body didn't tremble. His growl didn't come. He simply stood there, unmoving, a warm and breathing wall of quiet resolve. Then tires screamed. The sound split the afternoon in 2. A heavy delivery truck veered hard off the road, its front wheels mounting the curb with a grinding crash of concrete and rubber. The world seemed to compress into one terrible second. The boys scattered backward in panic, but one of them stumbled, hit the ground hard, and lay frozen directly in the truck's path. Lily pressed both hands against her ears. Atlas turned, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. The truck was still moving when Atlas made his decision. There was no hesitation, no pause, no calculation. He simply ran. His paws hit the pavement in hard, rapid bursts, covering the distance between him and the fallen boy in the span of a breath. The boy, Jason, lay flat on his back with his eyes wide and his arms raised uselessly in front of his face, frozen in the particular kind of fear that makes a person forget they have legs. Atlas reached him in seconds, clamped his teeth firmly around the hood of Jason's thick sweatshirt, and pulled with every pound of his body. The fabric stretched. Jason slid backward across the gritty pavement, his shoes dragging twin pale lines across the concrete. The front corner of the truck clipped the metal bench where Lily had been sitting just moments before, folding it sideways like a piece of paper, and then the vehicle lurched to a crashing stop against a concrete planter at the edge of the sidewalk. The impact scattered chunks of debris in every direction. A jagged shard of metal caught Atlas across his left shoulder and side. He yelped, a sharp and terrible sound, and dropped to the ground. The street went silent for exactly 1 second. Then the screaming started. People who had been walking, shopping, scrolling through their phones were suddenly running toward the scene or running away from it. Someone had already raised their phone to record. Lily stood frozen near the bench, her hands pressed flat against her ears, calling Atlas's name in a voice that kept breaking. Jason sat upright on the pavement, breathing in ragged gulps, staring at the dog lying a few feet away from him. Atlas had landed on his side. His chest was still rising and falling, but his eyes were half closed and his breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. A dark stain was already spreading through the fur at his shoulder, soaking the pavement beneath him in a slow, spreading circle. Jason crawled to him. He wasn't sure why. His knees were bleeding and his hands were shaking, and the rational part of his brain hadn't fully rejoined his body yet. He reached out and rested one hand lightly on Atlas's side and said his name. Just that, Atlas. The dog's eyes didn't open. His tail didn't move. His chest rose once more, shallow, and then held still for a moment that felt impossibly long. Atlas, Jason said again, his voice cracking down the middle. Nothing. The woman who had been standing at the bakery window pressed both hands over her mouth. A man nearby crouched down and said something about calling emergency services, but his voice sounded very far away. The only sound that fully registered was Lily's, small and terrified and relentless, calling a name that wouldn't answer. Sirens rose in the distance a few minutes later, growing louder with every second. But for Jason, kneeling on the cracked and bloodied pavement beside the dog who had just saved his life, those seconds felt longer than years. The emergency animal hospital on the south side of Denver had a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and muffled fear, the particular combination that belongs to places where life and loss sit side by side on plastic chairs. Lily and her mother Claire arrived 20 minutes after the ambulance had carried Atlas through the rear entrance. Claire had one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders and the other hand pressed tight against her own chest, as if trying to hold something together inside herself. Lily hadn't spoken since they'd left Elmwood Street. She held her folded cane across her lap and kept her face still in the careful way children do when they are trying very hard not to cry in front of strangers. The woman at the front desk spoke in a low, practiced voice, taking information, explaining procedures, using words like critical and stabilizing, with the kind of calmness that only made those words feel heavier. Claire answered every question. Lily listened to every answer. The hours that followed were the slow, grinding kind that refused to move at any normal speed. Claire brought her daughter a cup of hot chocolate from the vending machine. It sat untouched on the seat beside Lily. An overhead television played a news channel with the volume turned low, and somewhere in the building behind the front desk, machines beeped in patterns that Lily tried not to interpret. A volunteer brought a folded blanket without being asked. The gesture was small. It helped more than words could have. At some point past 9 in the evening, a veterinarian in blue scrubs appeared at the door to the waiting room. She was a compact woman with tired eyes and very steady hands, and she sat down across from Claire rather than standing, which Lily had learned meant the news was not going to be light. She spoke carefully, choosing each sentence the way someone chooses footing on uncertain ground. Atlas had sustained significant trauma to his left shoulder, 2 broken ribs, and lacerations deep enough to require surgery. The surgery had gone as well as could be expected, but the next 12 hours were critical. His body had been through a severe shock. There was internal bleeding that they had addressed, but the risk remained. She said the phrase, "We're doing everything we can," exactly the way people say it when they mean it and know it isn't quite enough. Claire pressed her lips together and nodded. Lily sat very still. Later, after the veterinarian returned to her work and Claire stepped outside briefly to make a phone call, Lily sat alone with the blanket across her knees and her hands folded in her lap. She didn't pray loudly or dramatically. She simply tilted her face downward and whispered Atlas's name several times, the way you repeat the name of something you love when you're afraid of what the world might do to it. Across the city, the story was already spreading. A bystander's video had been shared hundreds of times before midnight. News channels ran the footage in tight loops, the truck jumping the curb, the dog moving with impossible speed, the impact, the boy dragged to safety. Comments flooded in from strangers who had never met a guide dog and found themselves wiping their eyes at a screen. But the boy who mattered most wasn't watching the video. Jason sat in his own home in his own silence, unable to sleep, replaying those seconds in his mind until the memory of Atlas's unmoving body on the pavement became something he could not look at and could not look away from. The morning Atlas opened his eyes was a Tuesday, 5 days after the accident. Lily was already sitting beside his recovery crate when it happened, her fingers laced loosely through the wire mesh, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body. She had come every morning since the surgery, arriving with her mother before the clinic's doors were fully open, settling beside him with the patience of someone who has decided that waiting is its own form of love. The veterinary staff had quietly started leaving an extra chair beside Atlas's recovery space without anyone asking. They had all noticed what Lily's presence seemed to do to his vital signs. The monitors were more stable when she was near. His breathing came more evenly. One of the nurses mentioned it to the veterinarian in a hushed voice one morning, and neither of them said anything more about it. Some things in that building could not be fully explained by charts. He blinked slowly at first, the way living things do when they return from somewhere deep and dark and difficult. His eyes found Lily's face by instinct or memory or something that belongs to neither category and exists only between two creatures who have built their world around each other. Lily felt the shift in the air before anyone told her. She pressed her forehead lightly against the mesh and whispered, "There you are." Her voice was so steady it startled even her. Tears came a moment later, rolling silently down her face without any sound accompanying them, the quiet kind that come from relief too large to express any other way. Her mother stood a few feet behind her with one hand pressed over her mouth. The days that followed carried their own particular weight. Atlas was alive, and that was the first miracle. But alive and healed are not the same thing, and the gap between them became clear on the morning the veterinarian attempted his first assisted steps. He rose from his resting position with visible effort, his legs unsteady beneath him, and made it exactly 2 steps before his left side buckled and he went down hard on the clinical tile floor. The sound was soft but precise, the kind of sound that travels directly to the part of the brain that manages dread. Lily heard it from the hallway where she had been waiting. She stopped walking. Her face went completely still. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. The veterinarian came to the doorway a moment later, her expression composed and careful, and explained that this was expected, that the muscle and tissue around the shoulder needed time, that with consistent physical therapy, there was every reason for optimism. Lily nodded at each of these sentences. She was 7 years old and she nodded at them the way adults nod at difficult truths, accepting the words without entirely accepting the comfort they were meant to carry. Jason had been visiting since the 3rd day. He came quietly, never announcing himself, always asking at the front desk whether it was a good time before approaching the recovery room. He sat beside Atlas for hours without needing to fill the silence with words. On the afternoon of Atlas's first failed steps, he sat in the corridor with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and Lily sat down beside him without being asked. Neither of them said anything for a long while. Outside, the city moved on the way cities always do, loud and indifferent and alive. Inside that narrow corridor, something quieter and far more permanent was slowly beginning to form. 3 months had passed since the afternoon on Elmwood Street, and the world had the appearance of having returned to normal, the way a repaired surface looks smooth until you press against it. Atlas walked with a slight favoring of his left side that the veterinarian said would probably fade with more time and might not fade completely. Lily had adjusted to his new rhythm so naturally that most people watching them move through the city couldn't see the difference. Jason had changed in ways that were harder to describe than to observe. He had quit his old group of friends without drama or announcement. He had started getting up earlier. He had stopped filling silences with noise. His mother noticed but didn't ask. Some changes are best allowed to settle on their own terms. The 3 of them had fallen into a loose but genuine routine. Saturday mornings, Jason would meet Lily and her mother at the bakery on Elmwood Street, the same one where everything had begun. They would sit for an hour or so, and Atlas would rest with his head in Lily's lap, and Jason would drink whatever Claire ordered for him, because he hadn't yet developed the habit of knowing what he wanted. It was an ordinary arrangement. That was the thing about it that mattered most. It was ordinary in the way that only things built from extraordinary circumstances can ever truly be. The particular Saturday when everything shifted again was unremarkable in every visible way. The sky was a pale, clean blue. The air carried the smell of fresh concrete, because a crew had been working on the intersection outside the bakery all week. Equipment sat parked along the curb, large orange cones arranged in a staggered line, and somewhere behind a temporary barrier a pneumatic drill pulsed at irregular intervals, loud and unpredictable. Atlas had managed the noise well enough for the first hour, his head remaining low, his body staying calm beside Lily's knee. But as the drill shifted from its dull background rhythm to a sudden, violent burst, a sharp, metallic shriek that rang off the buildings like a gunshot, something inside Atlas snapped in a direction none of them expected. He was on his feet before any of them processed the movement. His body went rigid. His eyes lost their familiar focused calm and filled instead with something ancient and overwhelmed, the deep animal panic that no amount of training can permanently erase once trauma has written itself into the body. He pulled hard against his harness, and the motion was so sudden and so forceful that Lily's grip slipped. He bolted. Not far, not fast in the way a young dog bolts. His injured shoulder still dictated his speed. But he moved directly toward the open stretch of road at the end of the construction cones, where the barrier curved and left a gap that a dog his size could pass through without slowing. Lily called his name, her voice sharp with a fear she almost never let surface. Jason was already moving. He didn't think about what he was doing any more than Atlas had thought about it 3 months ago on Elmwood Street. His feet carried him forward and his mind arrived a half-second later. He could see the motorcycle before Atlas reached the gap, a delivery bike moving fast along the cleared lane, the rider's head down and his attention on the road ahead. The rider hadn't seen the dog. Atlas hadn't seen the motorcycle. The distance between them was collapsing at the speed of 2 moving objects that had no awareness of each other. Jason crossed the last few feet in a single motion, dropped to one knee, and drove his shoulder into Atlas's side, pushing him hard and sideways away from the open lane. Atlas hit the pavement and skidded to a stop against the base of a cone, stunned and panting. Jason remained on one knee in the gap for half a second, looking after him, and that half-second was exactly long enough for the motorcycle's handlebars to catch him across his right side. The impact threw him several feet and brought him down hard on the asphalt. The rider braked and skidded to a stop 20 yards down the road, dropping his bike and running back. Atlas scrambled back to his feet and turned. His eyes found Jason on the ground. He crossed to him without hesitating, lowering his body close to the pavement, pressing his muzzle against Jason's arm. A sound came from him then, low and steady and continuous, not quite a whine and not quite a bark. Something between the two. Something that had no name in any human language but carried its meaning perfectly. Lily reached them 30 seconds later, kneeling on the road with both hands outstretched, finding Jason's shoulder and Atlas's back at the same time. She held them both. The warm afternoon moved around them. The drill started up again in the distance. Indifferent and mechanical and completely unaware of what had just happened in the space beneath its noise. The paramedics arrived in under 4 minutes. To everyone standing on that stretch of road, those 4 minutes felt considerably longer. Jason lay on the asphalt with his eyes open and his breathing audible, short and careful, the way a person breathes when they are afraid of what a deeper breath might reveal. His right side had taken the full force of the impact and the subsequent fall, and even before anyone assessed the damage, the angle of his arm against the ground told the story clearly enough. Atlas had not moved from beside him. He lay pressed flat against Jason's left side, his chin resting on the pavement near Jason's shoulder, his breathing matching Jason's in a slow and deliberate rhythm that seemed less like coincidence and more like intention. When the paramedics came through the gap in the cones and crouched over Jason with their kit, Atlas raised his head and watched every movement they made with the steady, evaluating gaze of someone who has appointed themselves responsible for this person's safety and has not yet relinquished that position. Claire had reached Lily by then, guiding her back from the road's edge, one arm firm around her daughter's shoulders. Lily had stopped crying, not because the fear had passed, but because she had moved into a place beyond it where the body simply grows quiet and waits. She kept one hand extended in Atlas's direction, even after Claire guided her backward, reaching for something she couldn't touch from where she now stood. One of the construction workers had moved the orange cones to create a clear corridor for the paramedics. The motorcycle rider sat on the curb with his helmet in his hands and his face the color of old chalk, answering a police officer's questions in a voice barely above a murmur. He kept looking at Jason. He kept looking away. When the paramedics began preparing the stretcher, Atlas rose. He moved to the back of the ambulance with a deliberateness that stopped one of the paramedics mid-motion. The dog planted his front paws on the rear bumper and looked back once, directly at the team, then turned his eyes to Jason on the stretcher. The sound that came out of him was low and continuous, not a bark, not a whine, something between them that carried an unmistakable meaning. The senior paramedic, a broad-shouldered woman named Torres who had been working emergency calls for 11 years, looked at her partner and then at Atlas and then made a decision that was technically outside protocol and entirely correct. She stepped aside and said, quietly but firmly, "Let him up." Atlas rode in the ambulance beside Jason's stretcher, pressed close, his injured shoulder bearing the weight without complaint. Torres would later tell a colleague that in 11 years she had never seen an animal so deliberately and completely refuse to abandon someone. She said it the way people say things they mean to remember. At the hospital, Claire and Lily arrived 15 minutes behind the ambulance. The same waiting room, the same antiseptic smell, different plastic chairs that felt identical. Lily sat without prompting and folded her hands in her lap, and Claire recognized in her daughter's posture something that should not belong to a 7-year-old. The particular stillness of someone who has learned that hospitals sometimes give back what they took and sometimes do not. It sat heavily in Claire's chest as she checked in at the desk. The nurse recognized Lily from Atlas's earlier stay, though she didn't say so. She simply moved a little faster and spoke a little more gently. Jason's injuries included 2 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and road abrasion across the length of his right arm and thigh. None of it was life-threatening. All of it was serious. His mother arrived 40 minutes later, her coat half buttoned and her keys still in her hand, and sat beside Claire without knowing her name and without needing to. They were 2 mothers in a waiting room, and that was enough common ground for now. When the doctor came out and confirmed that Jason was stable and would be kept overnight for monitoring, Claire reached over and covered the other woman's hand with her own. Jason's mother exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a word. It didn't need to be. Lily waited until a nurse offered to bring her to the doorway of Jason's room for a moment. She stood there with Atlas at her side, his harness in her hand, and she didn't say anything dramatic or carefully composed. She simply said, "He did it for Atlas," and then, after a pause, "Just like Atlas did it for him." Nobody in that hallway disagreed. Some debts move in circles. Some circles become something else entirely, something more like belonging. Jason spent 4 days in the hospital. The first 2 were largely physical, navigating pain medication and the particular indignity of needing help with simple movements, the kind that healthy bodies perform without consciousness and injured ones must plan in advance. His mother visited morning and evening. Claire brought food in containers that were too large for one person and left without making a thing of it. Atlas came every afternoon, permitted through a quiet exception arranged by a hospital administrator who had seen the story online, and decided that paperwork was less important than what was clearly needed. He would settle beside Jason's bed for an hour or 2, heavy and warm and completely still, and Jason would rest his uninjured hand on the dog's back and stare at the ceiling in the way people stare at ceilings when they are sorting through something large and internal and not yet ready to speak it aloud. On the 3rd day, a hospital counselor named Dr. Miraose stopped by. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who wore her reading glasses pushed up on her head and asked questions with the patience of someone who has learned that the most important answers don't come when you push, but when you wait. She had been briefed on the situation, the accident, the rescue, the reversal. She sat across from Jason in the chair beside his window and asked him how he was feeling about everything. Jason gave the predictable answers first: fine, grateful, weird. She received each one without reaction and waited. The room was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation and the occasional soft sound of Atlas shifting at the foot of the bed. It was Atlas who changed something, though not through any deliberate action. He simply raised his head from his paws and looked at Jason with those steady, undemanding eyes, and Jason looked back, and something in that exchange moved a door inside him that had been shut for a long time. He started talking. Not loudly, not in a rush, but in the careful, halting way of someone who has not had much practice being truthful about the things that hurt. He talked about his father, who had left when Jason was 9, and whose absence had never been discussed directly in their house, only worked around like furniture too heavy to move. He talked about feeling overlooked at home, about the specific exhaustion of performing normalcy while carrying something invisible and heavy. He talked about how the group of boys he'd been running with made him feel larger than the emptiness did, and how the cruelty they passed between them like currency had felt, for a brief and terrible time, like belonging. He said he knew it was wrong the whole time. He said knowing something is wrong and stopping it are not the same muscle, and his had not been strong enough. Dr. Oze didn't interrupt. She didn't offer solutions or reframe his experience into something more comfortable. She simply received it, and her receiving it without flinching was, for Jason, the closest thing to relief he had felt in years. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him one question. What changed? Jason looked at Atlas again. He saved me when he didn't have to, he said, and I spent months watching him try to walk again because of it, and then he stopped, started again. I didn't think about it. I just moved. And I think that's the first time I did something that wasn't about how it made me look or how it made me feel. It was just, it needed to happen. He paused. I don't think I knew I could do that. Dr. Oze wrote a single word in her notebook, though she didn't show it to him. Later, she would tell a colleague that in years of working with adolescents, she had encountered very few moments of genuine self-awareness that arrived without being coached. This had been one of them. When visiting hours ended and Claire guided Lily in for their brief evening stop, Jason was quieter than usual but lighter in some way that wasn't entirely physical. Lily sat beside his bed and asked Atlas to lie down, and Atlas did, and the three of them stayed in that configuration without speaking for a while. No one needed to fill the space. The room held what it needed to hold, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that only forms between people who have stopped pretending. The bronze plaque was 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall, mounted at eye level beside the bakery's front door on a Thursday morning in early spring. It read, "Courage lives here." Below those 3 words, smaller text described briefly what had happened on the sidewalk outside that building on an ordinary autumn afternoon. A guide dog, a boy, a moment of grace. The bakery owner, a stout man in his 60s named Carl, had commissioned it himself and paid for it out of his own pocket, and told no one until it was already installed. He had also arranged the small gathering of neighbors, local press, and familiar faces who stood in a loose half-circle on the clean-swept pavement while the morning light came sideways through the gap between the buildings and touched everything in gold. Lily stood between Atlas and Jason, her hand resting on Atlas's harness, her other hand finding Jason's without looking. Carl stood a few feet away with a handheld microphone, which he held the way people hold microphones when they are unused to them and faintly embarrassed by the weight of their own words. He thanked people for coming. He thanked the community for its support after the accident. Then he stopped and cleared his throat in the particular way a person does when they are about to say something they have rehearsed and are now reconsidering the wisdom of in real time. He said it anyway. He told the gathering that on the afternoon of the accident, before any of it happened, Lily and Atlas had been sitting on his bench outside his shop for about 20 minutes. He said that he had stood behind his window and thought about going outside to ask them to move. Not because Lily had done anything wrong, not because Atlas had been anything other than calm and well-behaved, but because he'd been worried about how a large dog near the entrance might affect other customers' comfort. He said he hadn't gone out and done it, partly because he'd gotten distracted and partly because something in him had known it was wrong. But the thought had been there. He stood in front of the gathering and said all of this plainly, without softening the edges, and then he looked directly at Lily, and he apologized. Not for what he had done, but for what he had nearly done, and for the thinking that had produced the impulse in the first place. The microphone picked up every word and carried it out across the small crowd and beyond. Because someone was live streaming on their phone, and the clip would be shared several thousand times before the end of the day. Lily listened with her face turned toward his voice. When he finished, she nodded once, slowly, and said, "Thank you for saying it out loud." Her voice was steady and clear and entirely without bitterness. It was possibly the most adult sentence spoken that morning, and she was the youngest person present. Several people nearby had to look away. Carl exhaled through his nose and pressed his lips together and nodded back. Not trusting himself with further words, Jason stood through all of it with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes moving between the plaque, Lily, and Atlas. His ribs had healed to the point where he no longer thought about them with every breath. But he still moved carefully, an instinct the body retains longer than the injury itself. He had agreed to say a few words and had written them on a folded piece of paper that he now unfolded and looked at and refolded and put back in his pocket. When it came to his turn, he spoke without the paper. He said he had mocked Atlas on the day they met. He said he had said the word useless. He said it directly and without qualification, and he watched Lily's face as he said it, and he didn't look away. Then he said that the dog he had called useless had run into the path of a truck to drag him out of its way, and that he had spent the months since that afternoon trying to figure out how to be worth that. He said he wasn't sure he'd succeeded, but he intended to keep trying. He folded his hands and stepped back. Atlas, sitting at Lily's side through all of it, chose that exact moment to lean his shoulder lightly against Jason's leg. It was an ordinary gesture, the kind Atlas made 100 times a day. But in that moment, in that gathering, on that particular piece of pavement with its bronze plaque and its morning light, and its crowd of people who had come to witness something they couldn't quite name, it landed like a verdict, quiet, certain, and complete. The training center was called Compass, a low-built facility on the eastern edge of Denver with a large fenced yard and a smell of clean hay and dog that hit you pleasantly the moment you opened the door. It ran on a combination of state funding and private donations and the particular dedication of people who believed that the work being done inside its walls was worth more than it would ever be fully paid for. Jason had started volunteering there 6 weeks after the ceremony outside the bakery, initially coming on Saturday mornings and eventually extending to Sunday afternoons as well. He showed up on time, which the coordinator noted. He did what he was asked without discussion or complaint, which she also noted. What she noted most, however, was the way he worked with the dogs, not with the forced enthusiasm of someone performing goodness for an audience, but with a quiet, focused attention that looked less like volunteering and more like repair. The work itself was systematic and patient, the kind that rewards consistency far more than intelligence. New guide dog candidates came in as puppies, usually between 8 and 10 weeks old, and the early phase of training was less about commands and more about the world, socializing them to noise and movement and texture and unpredictability, teaching them that cars and crowds and loud strangers were not threats, building in them the fundamental confidence that would later allow them to carry a human being's safety without flinching. Jason was assigned to a litter of 3 chocolate Labradors in his first month, 2 females and a male, and he named them in his head after the first day, even though he knew naming them was the thing volunteers were gently advised not to do. He named them anyway. It didn't make him love them more. It made him accountable to them, which was what he actually needed. Atlas came to Compass on the Saturdays Jason was there, permitted by the coordinator as a kind of working demonstration of the finished product. He was slower than he had been before the accident, and his shoulder kept him from the longer exercise sessions, but his temperament remained precisely what it had always been. The puppies gravitated to him with the instinctive recognition animals have for the genuinely calm, and he tolerated their clumsiness with a steady patience that the coordinator said she wished she could bottle and administer to the human staff. Jason watched Atlas with the puppies the way students watch a master, not to copy the technique, but to understand the principle behind it. He was learning something that couldn't be written in a training manual. He was learning what it looked like to be entirely present for another living creature without needing anything back. The morning he found out about the boy named Elias was a Saturday in late spring, warm enough that the training sessions had moved outdoors. The coordinator called him into her office after the morning session, which in Jason's experience only happened when something had gone wrong or something had gone unusually right. She told him that the first puppy from his assigned litter, the male he had quietly called Archer, had completed the full certification process 3 months ahead of schedule. She said the matching process had placed Archer with a 9-year-old boy in Colorado Springs named Elias, who had lost his sight in a car accident 2 years prior, the same accident that had taken his father. She said Archer was being delivered to Elias the following week. She said she thought Jason should know. He thanked her and walked to the parking lot and sat in his car. Through the windshield, he could see the fenced yard, where 2 of the new intake puppies were running an obstacle course under the supervision of another volunteer. They were clumsy and enthusiastic and completely unaware of what they were being shaped into. He sat there for a while. Not crying, not thinking in any linear way, just sitting with the weight of what a thread can connect when you follow it far enough. A truck jumping a curb. A dog running without hesitation. A boy kneeling on pavement, ashamed and changed. Mornings in a training center, learning patience from an animal who owed him nothing and gave him everything anyway. And now a small brown puppy delivered to a child who had lost his father to a road, and who would now have something that could not replace that loss, but could stand faithfully beside it. Jason pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. He stayed like that for a few minutes. Then he went back inside. The training center was called Compass, a low-built facility on the eastern edge of Denver with a large fenced yard and a smell of clean hay and dog that hit you pleasantly the moment you opened the door. It ran on a combination of state funding and private donations and the particular dedication of people who believed that the work being done inside its walls was worth more than it would ever be fully paid for. Jason had started volunteering there 6 weeks after the ceremony outside the bakery, initially coming on Saturday mornings and eventually extending to Sunday afternoons as well. He showed up on time, which the coordinator noted. He did what he was asked without discussion or complaint, which she also noted. What she noted most, however, was the way he worked with the dogs, not with the forced enthusiasm of someone performing goodness for an audience, but with a quiet, focused attention that looked less like volunteering and more like repair. The work itself was systematic and patient, the kind that rewards consistency far more than intelligence. New guide dog candidates came in as puppies, usually between 8 and 10 weeks old, and the early phase of training was less about commands and more about the world, socializing them to noise and movement and texture and unpredictability, teaching them that cars and crowds and loud strangers were not threats, building in them the fundamental confidence that would later allow them to carry a human being's safety without flinching. Jason was assigned to a litter of 3 chocolate Labradors in his first month, 2 females and a male, and he named them in his head after the first day, even though he knew naming them was the thing volunteers were gently advised not to do. He named them anyway. It didn't make him love them more. It made him accountable to them, which was what he actually needed. Atlas came to Compass on the Saturdays Jason was there, permitted by the coordinator as a kind of working demonstration of the finished product. He was slower than he had been before the accident, and his shoulder kept him from the longer exercise sessions, but his temperament remained precisely what it had always been. The puppies gravitated to him with the instinctive recognition animals have for the genuinely calm, and he tolerated their clumsiness with a steady patience that the coordinator said she wished she could bottle and administer to the human staff. Jason watched Atlas with the puppies the way students watch a master, not to copy the technique, but to understand the principle behind it. He was learning something that couldn't be written in a training manual. He was learning what it looked like to be entirely present for another living creature without needing anything back. The morning he found out about the boy named Elias was a Saturday in late spring, warm enough that the training sessions had moved outdoors. The coordinator called him into her office after the morning session, which in Jason's experience only happened when something had gone wrong or something had gone unusually right. She told him that the first puppy from his assigned litter, the male he had quietly called Archer, had completed the full certification process 3 months ahead of schedule. She said the matching process had placed Archer with a 9-year-old boy in Colorado Springs named Elias, who had lost his sight in a car accident 2 years prior, the same accident that had taken his father. She said Archer was being delivered to Elias the following week. She said she thought Jason should know. He thanked her and walked to the parking lot and sat in his car. Through the windshield he could see the fenced yard where 2 of the new intake puppies were running an obstacle course under the supervision of another volunteer. They were clumsy and enthusiastic and completely unaware of what they were being shaped into. He sat there for a while. Not crying, not thinking in any linear way, just sitting with the weight of what a thread can connect when you follow it far enough. A truck jumping a curb. A dog running without hesitation. A boy kneeling on pavement, ashamed and changed. Mornings in a training center, learning patience from an animal who owed him nothing and gave him everything anyway. And now a small brown puppy delivered to a child who had lost his father to a road, and who would now have something that could not replace that loss, but could stand faithfully beside it. Jason pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. He stayed like that for a few minutes. Then he went back inside.